Brook, Lynn, and Drew face off, and an unlikely alliance may be forming. Let us start with Brook, Lynn, and Drew, because the confrontation between these two is the kind of scene that starts in one place and has the potential to end up somewhere completely different. And the journey between those 2 points is going to be fascinating to watch. Here is the setup. Drew is back on his feet, Drew is angry, and Drew is not limiting his revenge appetite to just Willow and Nina. The Quartermain family is on his list too. Tracy specifically has been a target of his frustration for years, and the broader Quartermain household represents a world that Drew has felt both connected to and excluded from in ways that have never fully resolved. Now that he has his voice and his mobility back and months of stored grievance to work through, the Quartermains are going to feel some of that energy, whether they are ready for it or not. Then there is Danny. Drew's complicated feelings about Danny, about his relationship with Scout, about the access Danny has had to his daughter during the period when Drew could not protect or control any of it, are real, and they are driving decisions that are going to affect people beyond just the immediate family. Drew wants Danny kept away from Scout. He has made that clear. And it is the kind of decision that reaches directly into the lives of people who have done nothing to Drew personally, including a teenager who has already been through an enormous amount this year. Brook, Lynn is not going to let that stand quietly. Brook, Lynn has a particular kind of loyalty that does not calculate the cost before it acts. When someone she loves is being threatened or cornered or treated unfairly, she moves toward the problem immediately and deals with the consequences of that movement later. Danny is in her orbit. The Quartermain world is her world. And Drew coming back and immediately reaching for control in ways that affect her family is exactly the kind of thing that brings out the most fierce and confrontational version of Brook, Lynn. So she goes at him, directly. In the way that Brook, Lynn always goes at things, without a filter and without a strategy, leading entirely with the heart. And Drew stands his ground completely. He is not moved by Brook, Lynn's passion, and he is not intimidated by her directness. He has something he wants from this situation, and he is not going to be argued out of it because someone came at him with feeling rather than leverage. But he does say something in that confrontation that lands with a particular weight. He tells Brook, Lynn, clearly, deliberately, with the quiet certainty of a man who has been planning this for months, that by the time he is finished, the Quartermains are going to lose everything. That is not a complaint. That is not frustration venting itself. That is a promise. A specific, directed, carefully considered promise from a man who has demonstrated that he is capable of carrying out exactly the kind of long, patient campaign that would be required to make good on it. Brook, Lynn is going to feel two things simultaneously after that conversation, and both of them are going to be uncomfortable. The first is anger, genuine, protective, righteous anger on behalf of her family and on behalf of Danny. The second is something colder. Something that recognizes the threat as real rather than theatrical. Drew rattled her, and Brook, Lynn does not rattle easily. Now here is where the story takes its most interesting turn, because Brook, Lynn, and Drew share something that neither of them has fully acknowledged yet. They both want Willow to face consequences. Drew wants it for reasons that are deeply personal and rooted in everything Willow did to his body and his freedom. Brook, Lynn wants it for reasons that are rooted in her marriage, in the history of manipulation and interference that has followed Chase around for too long, in the very human need to see someone who has caused damage actually be held accountable for it. The enemy of my enemy. It is the oldest alliance formula in the book. And it is exactly the kind of formula that Port Charles has proven over and over leads to alliances that are more dangerous and more complicated than either party anticipated when they first shook hands. But Brook, Lynn needs to be careful here in ways that she historically has not been careful about anything. Because Brook, Lynn is carrying her own secrets. The accident that put Jordan in that hospital. The decisions she made at that crash site. The framing of Willow that she has already admitted to Chase. Any of those things, in Drew's hands, become weapons pointed directly back at Brook, Lynn. And Drew, who has demonstrated a complete willingness to use information aggressively regardless of whether it was given to him in good faith, is not someone who can be handed vulnerabilities and trusted to leave them alone. Brook, Lynn knows this on some level. She has always known that Drew cannot be fully trusted. But knowing something and acting on that knowledge are different skills, and Brook, Lynn has never been particularly strong at the second one when her protective instincts are fully engaged. The alliance, if it forms, is going to be volatile. Two people with legitimate grievances against the same target, neither of whom can fully trust the other, both of whom are capable of going further than they should when they feel cornered. That combination is the recipe for spectacular drama. And Port Charles should probably clear a space for whatever is coming from this corner of the canvas. Willow is starting to sense the truth, and Drew's window is closing. Now let us talk about the clock, because Drew's advantage in this situation, the element of surprise, the ability to control when and how his recovery becomes fully known, is not going to last much longer. And what happens when that window closes is the question that is driving everything right now. Drew has been playing a very careful game since he walked out of that lake. He confronted Willow in that darkened house in a way that was terrifying and deliberate and absolutely calculated. He showed her what he was capable of, gave her a taste of the fury that has been building for months, and then stepped back to let her sit with the uncertainty of not knowing exactly what he was going to do or when he was going to do it. Psychological warfare. The kind that costs nothing but delivers enormous returns in terms of keeping the other person off balance. But Willow is not stupid. Willow has never been stupid, which is part of what made her choices so devastating. She is intelligent enough to have known better and chose her path anyway. And that same intelligence that drove her terrible decisions is now working overtime to analyze what Drew is doing and why. She is starting to sense that something is off. That the performance Drew has been giving, playing at helplessness in certain moments, controlling the information about his recovery, choosing when to reveal capability and when to conceal it, is exactly that. A performance. A man who is not simply recovering but actively managing perceptions and timing, and the drama of his own revelation. If Willow fully locks onto that understanding before Drew is ready for her to have it, everything shifts. Because Willow with full clarity about what Drew is doing is a different and more dangerous opponent than Willow operating in fear and uncertainty. Fear keeps people reactive. Clarity makes people strategic. And a strategic Willow who understands that she is in a chess match rather than simply waiting for punishment is Willow who starts making moves of her own. Drew needs to beat her to whatever punch she is preparing to throw. He needs to move before she fully recalibrates. Which means the timeline that he has been operating on, patient, deliberate, letting the revenge simmer until the perfect moment, may need to be compressed in ways he had not originally planned for. The fans watching all of this are deeply engaged and genuinely divided about what they want to see happen. And that division is one of the most honest and interesting things about this storyline because it speaks to something real about how complicated these characters actually are. Some viewers are firmly in Drew's corner. Whatever he did before, whatever complicated or even cruel choices defined earlier chapters of a story, nobody deserves what was done to him. Being shot, being paralyzed, being pushed into a lake. These are crimes. Real crimes with real victims. And the fact that the victim has a complicated past does not erase the legitimacy of what was done to him or his right to want justice. Other viewers are less convinced. They remember earlier versions of Drew. The choices he made that hurt people. The way he operated when he was in a position of power and was not always careful about what that power cost the people around him. They are watching the revenge storyline with a more skeptical eye, wondering whether a man who spent months stewing in his own grievances is going to come out of this as someone genuinely changed or simply someone with a new set of grievances to act on. And then there is the third camp, perhaps the most interesting one, that is not asking whether Drew deserves revenge, but whether revenge itself is what the story should be building toward. These are the viewers who want to see Drew have a genuine reckoning with himself. A moment where the months of stillness and the nearness of death and the face of his daughter looking up at him become the catalyst for something that looks less like payback and more like growth. A father who realizes that the obsession with Willow, the war with the Quartermaines, the accumulation of enemies, none of it is giving Scout the father she needs. And maybe, just maybe, the man who emerges from all of this chooses differently than the man who went into it. That version of Drew's story would be quieter than the revenge arc. It would take longer to land. It would require the audience to sit with ambiguity and complexity rather than the satisfying clarity of a villain getting what they deserve. But it would be the version that sticks. The version that changes who Drew is going forward rather than simply completing a cycle that started months ago. Port Charles rarely settles for the simple answer, when the complicated one is available. And Drew's story right now has more possible endings than almost anything else on the canvas. The fans weigh in, and the debate is everything. And finally, let us give space to what the people watching at home are actually saying, because the conversation around Drew's storyline is one of the richest and most divided in the general hospital community right now, and that kind of engagement is the sign of a story that is doing exactly what good storytelling is supposed to do. The first voice that has been speaking up loudly is the one that points to Drew's history. Before any of the season's events, Drew made choices. He went after people. He used his power and his position in ways that caused real damage. He was not a saint before Willow shot him, and the people pointing that out are not wrong. The full picture of who Drew Kane has been over the years is complicated, and the idea that his victimhood in this storyline somehow erases or supersedes the harm he caused before it is a point of genuine debate. But the counterargument carries real weight too. Nobody deserves to be chemically paralyzed and held prisoner in their own body for months. Nobody deserves to be shot twice and left without a voice or mobility while the person who did it walks free and manages their life. The severity of what was done to Drew is not canceled out by anything he did before it happened. Victims do not have to be perfect people to deserve justice. What the community seems to be converging on, even among people who disagree about the specifics, is the belief that Drew and Jason getting closer as brothers is something worth rooting for. The idea that what Drew witnessed in the moment when Jason came back and demonstrated genuine loyalty and genuine love for Scout, and Danny planted something in Drew. Something that reminded him what family actually looks like when it is functioning. Something that makes the obsessive, destructive version of revenge he has been planning feel less satisfying than it did when he was first pulled out of that lake. There is a version of Drew's story where he becomes the father Scout deserves, where he sets down the war with the Quartermaines not because he has forgiven them but because he has decided his daughter is worth more than the satisfaction of watching them lose everything, where his coming back to his body becomes the beginning of coming back to himself in a deeper sense. Not the man he was before Willow shot him, but something better. Something shaped by what he endured into someone who understands the cost of obsession because he has lived inside someone else's obsession and knows exactly what it does to the person it is aimed at. That is not the easy story. It is not the satisfying in the moment story. But it is the one that gives Drew Kane a future worth watching. And Port Charles, being Port Charles, will probably find a way to give us both the revenge and the redemption, tangled up together the way everything in this town always is, landing somewhere in the complicated middle where the best soap opera stories always live. Whether Drew beats Willow to the punch, whether Brook Lynn's confrontation becomes an alliance that backfires spectacularly, whether the clock runs out on Drew's game before he can execute whatever he has been planning, whether Scout's face changes his calculation at the last possible moment, all of it is coming. None of it is going to be simple. And every single bit of it is going to be worth watching.